The formation of the state in East Asia, thinking about the Shang dynasty, thinking about how organized society, at least in its earliest forms in the post-Neolithic period in Northeast Asia, developed over time, roughly about the second millennium BC, right? Until the last century of the second millennium BC, 1050 BC. And a couple of interesting things have come out. One was the role of religion and ritual in being able to be utilized or exploited as a tool for the control of society. There was also the idea of the city or the urban landscape becoming increasingly rationalized, at least in the East Asian context, and here we're talking about North China, and how various kinds of activities sort of reinforce themselves, but almost, at least from an archaeological point of view, thinking about these things, the idea that we may be looking at a society that has remains that sort of amplify, I think, the role, right, and to some extent the excesses of the social elite class. We very often don't necessarily see those that are the commoners of the lower levels of society, perhaps except for things like this, where we have these burial sacrificial pits outside of these large royal tombs that were built during this period of time. But again, ritual being probably one of the most important things for social control, mass scale organization, and thinking about the wealth and the materials of the economic capabilities of these societies in North China during this period of time, primarily concentrated on the production of material culture that could be then utilized in tombs, right, for those who are the political elite. So in this particular case, the consort Fu Hao, which we talked about, I think, to some extent in our class discussions over the last week, the consort of the ruler of the Shang kingdom, and here is somebody who's not really sort of the ruler, but sufficiently high enough in terms of political and social status that there was a need to provide for the tomb funerary items that were of a particular wealth and stature. Almost about 200 pieces of bronze, many of them very large, which represented a significant amount of economic resources that had to be poured in. At the same time, human remains, for example, they were interred in the tomb along with the main body burial, which is located here. I don't know if you guys can see it, but that's where the main body was located. And these are just basically attendant servants that were interred as part of the sacrifice, right, for this particular person. And along with that, of course, there were a significant amount of bodies, number of bodies that were in the surrounding vicinity of this particular tomb, okay, as part of the overall sacrifice in this particular burial. Language, which we talked a little bit about, I think, where we kind of thought about language as a means of control, particularly, I think, for the articulation of ritual and religion and the monopolization of language, which reinforce the social status of those who are of the ruling elite. So language in China is interesting because if you compare it to places like Mesopotamia, for example, language in Mesopotamia was in the Middle East, in places like Iran and Iraq today, about 4,000, 5,000 years ago when language was first developed. It was primarily for the purpose of managing trade, business, agriculture, but particularly the commercial aspects of it, okay? The rules that came out from the language, the formation of language in that region was to ensure that business could be conducted in a fair and equitable way, okay? In China, language was developed so that you could do divination. A very small number of people would have been able to understand and write this language, particularly on the oracle bones, such as the one here on screen. And the questions they asked were very specific to the kind of activities that were conducted by the highest levels of social elite, right? But if you could ask a question, get an answer, and you were the one who actually had the ability to do all of these things, it meant that you control the ability to remember things, okay? And one of the key things about language is the need to memorialize. In other words, I could be talking to all of you today, and without the ability to write something, you probably would forget about 80% of this lecture after the hour is done. Writing allows you to memorialize what has been articulated, right? And so because of that, if you are taking notes, okay, those of you online as well as here in class, um, the note taking itself allows you to remember what was said or discussed. And then as long as that writing remains, the record remains, you actually have a good record of what was articulated, right? So writing is interesting because it allows you to memorialize, to remember what was said outside of oral tradition in a way that could be handed down, not just from one person to another that had a relationship, but you could keep these writings. And over time, somebody who has absolutely no relationship with you, who wrote the thing, can actually look at what was written and have an understanding of what was said and what was discussed and some of the thoughts, okay? The biggest thing that I think came out of the Shang period was the level of human organization and social control. And here we have two terms that are utilized in social sciences, but primarily economic in nature, which is the structuralist or maximalist model, where all aspects of the economy and society are controlled and managed so that society can go towards a common goal, right? So you're controlling economy so that you can actually meet certain kinds of, societal goals. And the level of control is extremely high. And that's the reason why we use the term maximalist, right? As opposed to minimalist or generalist model, which basically means all economic activities and social organization patterns are left on their own, and society just basically develops on its own as and how it sort of develops. So kind of very incidental, it's not directed at all. And so when we think about East Asian society, especially in North China, by the end of the second millennium AD, what we do, second millennium BC, what we do see is this. So someone had asked what was the scale of manpower that was needed to build the walls of the city of Zhangzhou, right? One of the cities that we were thinking about that was constructed around about 1500 BC. And this is what we're looking at, right? So it's 10 meters high, 20 meters wide at the bottom. And so it's tapered as a wall, all right, as a city wall. 10 meters wide at the top, roughly about 7 kilometers wide. That's roughly about 3.5, 3.6 miles maybe. And so what we are looking at is about 200 square meters of earth for every meter of height of wall, all right, that's built. You multiply that by the entire length of the wall, and the amount of dirt that is needed is phenomenal. I mean, we're really looking at 13.9 million cubic meters of dirt. Okay, so that's if you want to think about it in cubic feet, you just multiply that by 9 times 3, which is 27. So multiply 13.9 million by 27, and that gives you the amount in terms of cubic feet. Okay, 7.55 meters cube of earth that can be moved or used for construction by one person for every 1 month of labor that's committed, 30 days that's committed to the construction project. And what it then translates to is that you need 5.3 million man days, right, in order to construct this wall. So if you needed to construct this wall within about a 2 to 5 year period, you're looking at thousands upon thousands of people working consistently for about 3 to 5 years in order to build this wall, okay? So that, I think, gives you a sense of the scale of social control and management that we're looking at in North China by the end of the second millennium BC. Now, because the question becomes, do we actually see the same phenomenon occur in Japan and Korea, right? Of course, at this time, that did not occur. But if we fast forward maybe about 1,500 years down the road into the first millennium AD, which we will look at, in about a week and a half, 2 weeks time, did we witness the same sort of scale of social control in the rest of Northeast Asia, like the Korean Peninsula and Japan, okay, by about the turn of the 180 period, okay? So there's just some things to think about in terms of the scale of societal, control, management, and also then therefore culturally, how did Northeast Asia think about people, think about society, and think about these sorts of things by about 1000 BC. Okay. Any questions so far? Anybody online? Anyone has any questions? No? Okay. So let me move on then. So by the time we get to about 1000 BC, a couple of interesting things began to happen, right? So firstly, you get this very well-developed sort of social control in Northeast Asia, in the North China Plains. But there are a couple of inherent sort of dilemmas that were starting to manifest themselves quite clearly by about 1000 BC. So the first one being, while you can control society quite well and mobilize it quite well by this point in time, there were some inherent weaknesses. The first one being the absence of any sort of bureaucratic structure. So in other words, you didn't really have a governmental system that allowed for you to control society in sort of a very detailed manner. It was very top-down. Power was aggregated right at the top, and it was still in some ways fairly primitive in that it was highly dependent on the charisma of the ruler, okay? And so if the ruler was powerful and the ruler was someone who could convince the other sort of, fellow rulers, the first amongst equals around him in the neighboring sort of fiefs and areas, that he was the person who should be, right, the first amongst equals, and he would do well, right? But if he did not have that charisma, then therefore there would have been some problems, right, to be able to sort of garner the larger regional sort of resources that we talked about in order to sort of supply the cities and also to keep the whole system going. So there was some interesting inherent challenges that were going on by the end of the second millennium BC, around about 1000 BC. And we see this round about the date 1050 BC, where the last Shang ruler was overthrown by a fellow king in a nearby area who was known by the name Zhou. Right, that's a family name. And the Zhou king overthrows the last Shang ruler ostensibly because of his excesses. One of the key things that was mentioned in some of the historical texts from the first millennium BC that records the founding of the Zhou dynasty in 1050 was that the Shang ruler, the last Shang ruler, was a megalomaniac, right? He had no respect for human life, killed lots of people in order to sort of feed the ritual sacrifices that they had established as part of the burial sacrifices and so on and so forth. And so as part of that legitimacy of overthrowing the Shang dynasty by the Zhou rulers apparently were trying to put a stop, okay, to these sorts of practices, including the killing of life. Yeah.
So because this was, how do you say their names?
Shang.
Shang.
So Shang,
Uh-huh.
and then Zhou. So Shang, and then Zhou.
Zhou.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So when Zhou overthrew Shang, that's when it became more brutal, you said?
No, it actually, the argument was that because the last Shang ruler had become so brutal that the legitimacy for overthrowing the Shang dynasty as the first amongst equals and then establishing themselves, the Zhou dynasty, as the first amongst equals, was to try to eradicate, right, this lack of respect for human life, the amount of sacrifices that was going on, and so on and so forth. Basically, the social excesses that had developed over the Shang dynasty. So that's a good question, right? So they tried doing that in 1050 BC and were successful. And what you find then is substantial changes, at least in North Chinese culture, state control, social control over the next 400 years or so. So the first thing is that human sacrifices actually reduced in number substantially and actually completely disappeared by about 700 BC. So what was a key characteristic of the Shang period, which was these large-scale human sacrifices that accompanied these large royal tombs and tombs of the elite, no longer occurred after a 400-year period, right? So the Zhou were particularly concerned, at least in terms of the social agenda they had for their rulership, and that was that human sacrifices would actually no longer be practiced. So that took about 400 years, but that actually occurred. The second thing that occurred from 1050 BC that was established by the Zhou dynasty was development of ritual as a means of articulating political legitimacy. Now, in the Shang dynasty, they did that through sacrifice, right? Through sacrifice, through the burial interment of burial goods and so on and so forth, the utilization of economic resources for that purpose. For the Zhou, from 1050 onwards, one of the things they did was, while burials were still important, political legitimacy was no longer tied to the ability to have lavish burials. Instead, political legitimacy was established through rituals in the living life. So they began to have things like the concept of the son of heaven. Okay, so the ruler of the Zhou dynasty was articulated as somebody who was anointed by heaven, and heaven that is not a person, it's just like a concept, right? The spiritual realm, okay? That's higher than the natural realm that we live in, all right? In this higher spiritual realm, which is an amorphous sort of entity that is not an individual sort of deity, has identified an individual and a family lineage, which in this case was the Zhou dynasty, as the son of heaven and therefore the rightful ruler with political legitimacy to rule over, okay, the lands that were controlled by the Zhou dynasty. And the third thing that emerges is the bureaucracy. The Zhou dynasty began to put in place a system of officials, knowledgeable men, talented men, who would help to run the various aspects of society, including its economy, the military, for example, the cities, and so on and so forth, managing basically of the population. Okay, so in some ways we could think about this period of time as the development of a society, a state that was for the benefit of what? The people, right? In a broad sense, as opposed to the development of a state for the purpose of whoever was the social elite. Okay, it's an interesting, somewhat nuanced shift in the reason why you would rule over people, right? Why you would rule a social group or society, but nonetheless a fairly significant one, right? It changes the nature of the state and the reason why the state exists. So much so that between 900 BC to 750 BC, a couple of things occur. One, previously you would have, these princes that would be in these different regions in the Shang lands, and they would do their own thing, they have their own sort of royal burials and so on and so forth. But the level of organization in terms of the bureaucracy was very, very limited, right? But from 900 BC onwards to about 750 BC, the lands in North China began to organize themselves into what began to look like states, and states that had hereditary lands, power that was based on moral obligation to the larger society, the common man, and the establishment of a patron-client relationship that was asymmetrical, obviously. So whoever was the ruler and the political elite were obviously much more powerful than those who were people who were not the political elite or social elite. But there was a relationship that bind these two groups together, right, across the social hierarchy. And this relationship was a reciprocal one, okay? One where you had a patron and then you also had a client, and both had a symbiotic relationship with each other that was mutually beneficial, okay? And then along with that was the reliance of ritual and moral arguments that provided moral authority authority for those who were in political power. And so it's really interesting that you actually see this shift occur in Northeast Asia and particularly in North China around about the first millennium BC, away from, sort of whoever was going to be in charge would control everything and did what they wanted, to basically a system of society where those who were in charge actually were in charge, as it were, for the benefit, right, of society at large. Okay, and that's actually a really big shift. I would also say that it was not the Northeast Asia was not the only place that had this shift in philosophy, right, societal philosophy. If you think about it, the Greek, the Asian archipelago, the Hellenistic lands were going through similar sort of, thought processes with people like Homer, all the way down to Athenian democracy, and then subsequently with ones like Herodotus and so on and so forth by the end of the first millennium BC, right? So China was not the only place. It's interesting that the first millennium BC was a time when people around the old world seemed to begin to think, right, about what was the point of society, what was the point of rulership and kingship, and ideas about, sort of moral authority, obligations, and so on and so forth. Okay. Here's an example of what I mean by that big shift, right, in terms of societal perspective. Okay. In the late Shang, around about 1200 BC, here's an example of this item that's cast in bronze. So this is a fairly large ceremonial, it's called a ding. Basically what it is it's just basically a pot on a stand, right? Okay, 4 legs, okay? And the word fang just basically means it's a square shape or rectangular shape, right angle form, okay? And obviously if the moment you look at it, right, what is the purpose of this? I mean, obviously it's associated with burials, but what do you do with this thing specifically? Anyone has any ideas?
Maybe cleansing, washing?
Mm-hmm. It could be washing. It's like a basin. Yeah, it could be filled with water. Yeah, that's a possibility. What else?
Maybe
Anyone online?
maybe cleansing the body of the deceased.
Uh-huh. You could be using it to cleanse the body of the deceased. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What else? Anyone else?
Could you use it for cooking?
Sorry?
Could you use it for cooking, like put a fire underneath the barrel?
You could possibly put a fire underneath here. You could possibly put a fire here, for example, and that could be used for cooking. Again, ceremonial wise, but nonetheless, that it may have this very practical function. Yeah. What else? Anything else?
I don't know how big it is, but could it be used for burning incense?
So this one is particularly huge. It's about maybe
Oh, never mind.
20, 30 inches across. So it's a relatively large piece of thing. It's not a small little item. It's quite huge, right? And yeah, so you could be putting something in there, for example, and then burning it like incense, for example. That's another possibility. Yeah. So these are all great ideas. Archaeologists obviously suspect, because there's hardly any remains left in there, it's organic, whatever was going on, suspect that it may have been a libation basin. So basically wine or some kind of a liquid, right, ceremonial liquid that was put in there as part of the ritual offerings, right, for whoever was buried with this item, okay? And it's interesting because there's writing in there on the inside of the wall as well. And this is the translation of the writing. Now, if I ask you the question, what are maybe two of the most important things that this writing actually talks about? What would they be? Thematically, what are the key issues that this writing, this inscription actually talks about?
Are you talking about like the specific details about what they're preparing for?
Mm-hmm.
So like Jihai, is Jihai the place?
No, Jihai is the name of the year. So in the year of Jihai,
Yang was in.
Right, the guy's name is Yang.
Yeah, and he was in Peng preparing the chariot. So something offering for the Duke. Is the Duke deceased? Sorry.
No, he's not. Yeah.
Okay, so he made a sacrificial vessel. Is what I was gonna say is important for what.
Right. So you have a relationship, right? The relationship between a guy called Yang with the Duke of Shang, right? Okay. And it's a one-on-one relationship, okay? Does not actually represent the relationship of a society with the ruler of Shang or the Duke of Shang. Instead, it is this person who was of high political and social status in the area of Peng, right? And his relationship with the Shang ruler, right? So it's a very specific elite to elite relationship. What else? What else? What else might we be thinking about?
Maybe like what his job was.
And so, what do you think his job was?
Well, it said preparing chariots at the top, but then at the bottom it said like, I don't know if the vessel or like what's made for him, but we made this for like the father. Right.
Okay, so in terms of his work, we could also be thinking about preparing chariots as well. And again, it's very specific. It's in some ways is not necessarily an occupation or a function that requires substantial value added from the brain, right? Organizational skills and so on and so forth. It's a kind of very practical but very specific, and to some extent almost kind of a ceremonial kind of a position, which was just to prepare the chariots, right? So in terms of its function or role, will be another one. And relatively low level in terms of, I think, the level of skill to some extent. The third one that one could think about is that obviously this is a sacrificial vessel, okay, a vessel that's used for sacrifice. So the function of the vessel was to actually utilize it for what? For sacrifice, okay? And so therefore that whole thing about the Shang religion, sort of comes to mind, right? Okay, these items were very functional for very, very specific reasons, which was for ritual, and specifically ritual of the Duke of Shang or the ruler of Shang, okay? Fast forward about 300 years to 900 BC. And this instead is what we begin to see, right? They're still using bronze to cast items. But what is really interesting about the bronze items that began to be cast around about 900 BC, this is just about 100 and 150 years after the Zhou dynasty takes over, right, in North China, okay? And what we're beginning to see here are very, very interesting changes. So the first change is what? I mean, comparing this form to this form, what are some of the significant changes, at least in terms of the form? Anyone?
The shape is different.
The shape is different, yeah. Good, obvious observation, but that actually is one very important one. And that is the shape is different. What else? What else is different? The size. This item, by the way, is not very big. This item is huge, okay? This item, on the other hand, is relatively small, only about this size, okay? It's almost half the size, okay? What else?
There's no legs anymore. The design of it looks like the design is, for the most part, changed.
So you don't have legs, no stand, no legs, yeah.
The writing seems to be on the bottom instead of the sides.
So you have writing on the bottom. Okay. And what do you think are the implications of the absence of legs? Anybody?
You carry it.
So you have to carry it?
I wasn't going to say anything about the legs, but I was going to say that it's pretty interesting that if the item itself is so small, then the writing must be like really delicately.
Right. Yeah, which actually is an important indication. So in order to make this inscription on the side, you actually had to carve into the clay mold that you were making while it was wet, okay? There was also a limit to the number of characters that you could do on the side of a clay mold because the clay is drying out, so you had to do it fast. There was a limited amount of time you had to get on with it, okay? So that's part of the reason why this inscription looks the way it does. And in some ways, the content of this inscription, what it says, almost looks like it was written in point form. It's not long sentences, okay? This, on the other hand, we're really looking at very long prose. It's almost like a poetry, if you look at it. Very, very structured in terms of its layout, okay? And importantly, it was inscribed. In other words, somebody etched the writing onto the bronze item. It wasn't done on the clay mold, okay? So if you don't actually do the writing on the clay mold, what it means is that you could be making lots of these guys, right? And then the writing can be very specific to the purpose of this particular item at a post-manufactured point in time, okay? And that's probably what was happening, right? These items were made in fairly large quantities, and then as and when it was to be given to somebody or to be utilized in a particular way for ceremony, they would then inscribe it, right, with the inscription so that it would be contextualized to whatever they were trying to do, okay? So the writing changes, the nature of the writing changes, and importantly, it wasn't just the Shang elite, therefore, that were monopolizing writing now, right? By the Zhou dynasty, a larger number of people could actually be doing this writing, okay? Because language was becoming increasingly proliferate and widespread, all right? No legs is an interesting point, and that's partly because you are not actually doing something functional anymore with this item, okay? This item has become ceremonial, right? The actual physical function of an item changes because previously you could have utilized things like fire, you could have put things in there, and so on and so forth. You no longer are doing that anymore. Almost what? The writing itself is the most important thing, right? That represents this particular piece of thing, okay? And I don't know about you, but if you have items like this without legs that are tall, chances are there is a table involved or some kind of an elevated surface that's horizontal too, okay? And so it looks like this thing was used along with like certain other kind of thing, either a stand or piece of furniture, like a table, for example, because you would have had to put it on there. Otherwise, it's on the floor. It's kind of very awkward, okay? And especially when it's small. This is the inscription that was actually on that's on that particular piece of bronze item, okay? So same exercise, looking at it, what are some of the key themes that we can pick out from this particular inscription of this 900 BC bronze item? Anyone? I'll give you a minute to read it because it's quite long compared to the other one. This is actually really long.
Wow, this is on that tiny little thing.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah, so it's a lot of information, okay? So info overload is one. What else? That's a good one, info overload. What else?
It almost looks like it's a song praising the Duke.
Sorry?
Is it a song praising the Duke?
Yep. It's a song praising the Duke of Zhou, and not just the Duke of Zhou, but several generations of the rulers of the Zhou dynasty, right? Because if you think about it, he's talking about the Son of Heaven. You know, here you have the High, but that's kind of like the first ruler of the Zhou dynasty, and then you have another one. Let me see. The Duke of Zhou, which is the second one, and then you have the ancestor of whoever was sort of commissioning the casting of this item. You had his sons, his grandfather. I mean, the list goes on, right? And then obviously down to here, the chap himself, right? Okay. So multiple generations of rulers and those who assisted the ruler, which is in this case this person who belongs to this family of bureaucrats and scribes that serve the rulers of the Zhou dynasty for for several generations. What else?
They mention a lot with ancestors.
Mm-hmm. So there's the mentioning of ancestors, yeah, high ancestor, lineage, grandfather. And what's really interesting about this is that you don't find that in Shang writing at all. Okay, and so what is beginning to manifest here, obviously, is family lineage, multi-generational lineage seems to be an important social theme, right? It needs to be recorded, right? And so therefore, family name as well, right? Your surname becomes important. Okay. What else? Anyone else?
I don't know if it's important, but there is the little part where it talks about some type of battle where like the
Yeah.
king
Yeah.
defeated Yin.
So would you read out the line that we're looking at here?
It's when the martial king had already defeated Ying.
Yeah.
And it continues. So there was just some type of battle.
Yeah, and Yin obviously is the city of Yin. We talked about that last week. We were thinking of the Shang, right? So it's a reference basically to the Shang rulers. Okay, so yeah, there's warfare. Even things like where is it? Martial king, yeah, and then again at martial king. So military capability obviously was an important one. What else? Anything else? Anybody?
I noticed that it says like a lot of sons. So it goes like the son of heaven, and then it says transferring and nurturing sons and grandsons,
Mm-hmm.
and then it goes back to like, and then it says like respect in the sons of heavens again. So it has a lot of like to do with I'm assuming like a lot of with guy wise or like boy wise, just a lot of like male aspect.
Okay, so the possibility that we're looking at preferential regard for males, yeah, in society, yeah. Yeah, yep. What
Yeah,
else?
I guess he was, I guess, in terms of this culture, his culture, he was relatively religious, wherein at the top it says that he was diligent and without flaw, faithfully making offerings to the spirits above and below.
Yeah, and
So-
notice that the making of the offerings to spirits above and below, religiosity was important, but in some ways the object of ritual and religion and worship is no longer the self, right? Like the Shang ruler, for example, but instead was outside, right? Some kind of an external spiritual entity that was still kind of not very well defined, but it's out there, right? Okay. And that's a good one. So there's a shift in terms of the nature of religion and how they saw the role of sacrifice. And here it's not human sacrifice, but it's just basically normal offerings. Okay. A couple of things that like I kind of identified, and that's the ones in red. The first one being obviously the Son of Heaven. That this is a term that does not show up at all during the Shang period, but by the Zhou becomes something that is articulated. Okay, it only takes 150 years, but it obviously takes root in the social elites sort of mind frame, right? That the ruler of the Zhou dynasty is called a Son of Heaven. Okay, so political legitimacy is based on anointing by some amorphous entity known as heaven. Okay, the other one obviously is the notion of what? Culture and martial. Okay, so on the one hand, military capability, obviously not necessarily as a fighter, but probably as a military strategist, okay, is a critically important skill and identifying marker for the rulers of the Zhou dynasty. But that's balanced with something else, which is what? Culture, right? So you're not just, some guy who's crazy for blood and warfare and all that sort of thing. You're also somebody who is promoting culture, promoting, as it were, the softer side, the soft skills, right, of what is expected of a ruler. You have things like ancestor, which I think some of you have identified, martial king. There is this interesting thing that's also identified, which is the borderland, which is another term that has not showed up in the Shang dynasty, but by the Zhou comes about, okay? And that's an interesting geographical term because it then therefore distinguishes those who are part of this group and those who are what? Who are not, And it's utilized along with the word savage or barbarians, okay? So whoever is not part of this particular social group, right, known as the Chou people, is therefore not only not part of this group, but is also what? A savage, right? So it's less developed, okay, as the rest of us. Okay, and so therefore, civilizationally, that actually is an important discourse that shows up during this period of time. Okay, and then a couple of other red ones that you can look at after today's class. I'll post the PowerPoint slides online on BB Learn, and you can think through some of these things because I think they're actually quite interesting and very, very important. But of critical importance to this particular item really is this entire section of the inscription, basically the one on the right, okay, and which talks about that patron-client relationship, right, based on service to the ruler of the Zhou dynasty. Multiple generations of his families, males, have served in the court, right, and served the rulers of the Zhou dynasty. And he himself is just one of several who have come before him, and this is their familial or family function within the society itself, okay? And part of that obviously has to do with the ability to utilize the language for whatever reasons it is, because he's using the word for scribe, okay? So language is no longer limited to the rulers of the Shang dynasty, all right, but now is shared amongst a much broader base of people, and they're utilizing language skills, right, as part of what they do in this particular society. So you get this patron-client relationship developing, which is one, loyalty to the ruler, family lineages. So some of the things that you have mentioned, really good. But anyway, family lineage, loyalty to the ruler, and also administrative function as something that represents the social or political elite of society by about 900 BC. That gets further consolidated by the time you get to 750 BC, and it's accompanied by an interesting development that occurs, right, which is the geopolitical power consolidation across the Chinese landscape. So what was going on? This is a very late woodblock print. It's not from the Zhou dynasty, but it shows a 2,000-year-old technology that's been used in China. This woodblock print was done, printed and published around about 680. So it's about 2,500 years after the establishment of the Zhou dynasty. But it illustrates a technological development that occurred around about 500 and 750 BC. Does anybody know what that technological development is? Anyone? The plow, okay. But what's so special about the plow? So plows have been around, all right, since like the Neolithic period. So what is it about this plow that makes it so special?
It's also planting the rice as it digs the holes.
Okay, that's a possibility. So there's some seeds here. I don't know if anybody can see that. Okay, the seeds here. So as it's plowing, it's sort of scattering the seed, okay? So that's one, yeah. Might be an increase in productivity level as a result of that. What else?
I was gonna say more efficient, like quicker.
It could be more efficient. Anything else? What else?
Is it because now it's attached to an ox?
Okay, good try. No, because I think the oxen was utilized as a domesticated animal for the field, like at least about 2,000 or 3,000 years before 750 BC. Think technology. Technology is the real key here in terms of understanding what the breakthrough is in this picture.
Farming tools?
Okay, so what do you mean by that?
A more efficient and effective way of planting and plowing land for food production?
Yeah. So the hoe is important, but again, the hoe has been developed during the Neolithic period, the real technological breakthrough actually is this part here. Okay, all right. And for those who can read Chinese, these two characters just basically mean iron. This means iron, okay, and this means the point, the tip, okay. So around about 750 BC, one of the most important technological breakthroughs that occurred in North China was actually the development of iron technology. It allowed for some things to happen, one of which was obviously iron is really hard. And so you could plow through land in North China. Remember, they have winters up there. Earlier, you could then therefore grow multiple crops. You can have crop rotation within a year. And so the agricultural output for any society in North China around about 750 BC, if you had iron technology, allowed you to produce a lot more food than you actually did before, right? For millennia before, right? And so the result was what? A massive population explosion, okay? For states or areas that actually had the ability to manipulate iron ore, you therefore suddenly grew in terms of the manpower that you could control. The amount of agricultural output that you produced was phenomenal, was increased in a phenomenal way. And you therefore then had critical advantage over other states or feudal lords in that area, the geographical part of East Asia, that did not still possess iron technology, okay? It didn't last for very long. It's like a 100, 200 year differentiation, but the point is it was sufficiently long to provide certain states and feudal lords with that critical advantage that others did not have, okay? And importantly, iron actually started to be used in China on the northwest side first, and then the southwest side before it moved towards the northeast. So much so that the traditional states that were the power bases of the Shang dynasty and the early Zhou dynasty, which was Northeast Asia where the fertile lands are located, right around the area of Anyang. For those of you who could remember your map quiz, that's where the fertile lands are located, right? But because of iron technology, they were able to increase the agricultural output in northwest, northeast, and southeast, northwest and southwest China by about 750 BC, which they weren't able to capitalize on in the northeast part of China until much later, okay? And so those places actually had a critical advantage. Other things that happened, you could now make a lot more lethal weapons with iron than you could before. Bronze weaponry was extremely prestigious because bronze was expensive. So only certain ones in the military apparatus actually had these swords, right? But with iron, you could produce a whole bunch of things with iron that was very cheap, was highly disposable. You didn't have to worry too much about exponential costs because of the use of copper, which was very rare. Iron is available everywhere. And so once you had iron smelting technology, you actually could arm your military with weapons that were very deadly, you know, at the kind of scale that you didn't see before, right? And along with a larger population base because of the agricultural boost, you had a much larger army, okay? So there was a military advantage that could be gained as a result of iron technology that shows up in North China by about 750 BC, okay? Does anybody know why this is actually important in terms of iron technology? Why is a crossbow lock important? So crossbows are actually absolutely important as a technological advancement in military ordnance because you can now kill somebody like really far away before they can get to you, right? A sword, on the other hand, as you say, is a close combat, right? Close contact combat kind of a weapon. And so there's a 50-50 chance that you might be killed along with the other guy. Crossbows that were developed roughly about the 5th century BC become important. The other thing that's important, obviously, is that crossbows actually are very powerful projectile machines, all right? And in order to use a crossbow, you actually need to have an arrow, but you need to have a tip on an arrow too. And this is where iron comes in, right? The arrowheads are cast iron arrowheads. And so because of the availability of iron and the cheap, sort of availability of that metal, the arrows themselves are actually highly dispensable. And so the combination of the two makes any military that possesses this technology extremely lethal compared to other ones. So here's a bronze item, which has, and it's just really sort of an aside. I just wanted to show this to you guys, because on the sides of this particular bronze item is a depiction of a warfare, right? A scene, a battle scene, and all the different kinds of weapons that were developed by this point in time, particularly the metal ones, which is located in this part of the picture, are depicted, and these are all metal weapons that were done by the 5th century. And so one of the things that we need to think about is the impact of geopolitical consolidation on societies, right? We're looking at states that are competing for essential resources now. Okay, agricultural output, sort of skyrockets. You have the need, therefore, for land. You also have large numbers of people that you never had before. You need to have, obviously, therefore, larger control of water, other kinds of natural resources, including mining, like iron ore, and so on and so forth. And then along with that, therefore, is an increase in intellectual capabilities, right? You need to rely on people who had exceptional brain ability. Militarily, also in terms of economic, abilities to administer and manage economic resources, the ability to develop logistical, frameworks for your state. And so there became a high demand for talented people in this part of the world by about 6th century BC, 5th century BC. Okay, so if you were a military strategist, if you had like brains that could manage economy, and so on and so forth, land management, water management, hydrology is another one. You knew how to dig canals well, for example, you could manage water. The list goes on. You became somebody that was highly demanded. Okay, and it's not just one state in this part of the region. Obviously, there are many competing states, right? And everybody is competing for brain power. Okay, and so if you were somebody who had brains, you became, a prized possession that everybody was competing for, right? It's a great time to be somebody who was smart. And along with that, therefore, were developments of things like philosophy, right? The philosophies of state and of life. This is the period that is known as the 100 Schools of Thought. Obviously, it's just a term. There were probably maybe less or more, but the idea is that there was a huge proliferation of political philosophies about how states should function, people should function, what was the role of the ruler in society, and so on and so forth. And 3 of the main ones that came from this period of time was Confucianism, marked by this guy. This is a portrait of Confucius, okay? And then you had Taoism. And usually you have, Lao Tzu, which is like the grandmaster of naturalism, right? Tao is naturalism, the way, okay? In Chinese philosophy, usually is riding the water buffalo, okay? Sort of to illustrate, the notion of naturalism, okay? As opposed to sitting on a chair, right? Which is a constructed item, okay? And then you have this person here, Han Feizi, who represents the school of legalism. Okay, these were the 3 major political philosophies that survived through the first millennium BC that continued to influence Chinese political philosophy, and to a large extent, East Asian political and social philosophy over the next sort of 2,000, 2,500 years, even up to today. Okay. Some of the things that the Zhou dynasty did in order to establish societal order was to begin to change the way that society saw itself. And this is a set of bells that were excavated from a tomb that's dated to the 4th century BC. Okay, now why are these bells important? I mean, apart from the fact that you would play music on them, okay? So it's not just chamber orchestra as in like you're just sort of enjoying the music. You actually use the music to accompany ritual ceremony, right? And so what you're trying to do is establish order in society so that aspects of societal interaction, such as the emperor with his counselors, the bureaucracy with people who are being ruled, father and son, mother and daughter, I mean, the list goes on, right? Are all sort of governed by a set of rituals that establishes everybody's position in society, okay? And so through that process, societal order, therefore, is sort of established and society can be maintained, right? And the Son of Heaven, the ruler, is basically the final sort of apex and arbiter of all of these different ritual relationships, okay? So that's actually a very important development compared to the Shang. And just very quickly moving into a couple of maps, and then I think we're going to sort of end off in about a minute. What we see are a couple of interesting things. So around about 1050, when the Zhou dynasty takes over, and by the way, the Zhou are just located here. Let me see if I can pull that up again. Here we go. So the Zhou are actually located in this particular territorial holding here, right? They beat the Shang dynasty, and over time, they basically take over the whole cultural landscape, okay? 1050, we're looking at quite a lot of different fiefdoms, small little states that sort of agree that the Zhou dynasty is the first amongst equals, but they're actually doing their own thing as well, but sharing, you know, common cultural traits. By about 750, the number of these fiefdoms and states actually reduced from roughly about 200 to only about 10 or 11 or 12, right? Each of them are fairly large. At this juncture, this is where iron technology becomes important, right? And it has a reinforcing effect in terms of consolidation of territorial holding power in society in China from this point onwards. So much so that by the time you get to 450 BC, you really are only looking at no more than 7 or 8. And these are really huge states, okay? Notice that the biggest ones are located where? In the northwest and the southwest and south of China, okay? No longer up here in this central part of where the old Shang cultural domain used to be located. And over another 200 years, by 221 BC, all of those lands are consolidated under a singular rule known as the Qin dynasty, okay? So that's this process that's going on. Now that's Chinese history. And just as a concluding thought, we see these historical trajectories towards political consolidation and the formation of a unitary state. What about the rest of East Asia, right? How does this actually impact the development of places like the Japanese archipelago and the Korean Peninsula, okay? And I like to suggest, at least as a teaser, that whatever was happening in China over the first millennium BC actually had a significant and substantial impact on the rest of East Asia over the next 1,000 years in the first millennium